Hello, good evening, and welcome to this evening's BIC Streams session, Uncivil City, Livable Cities and Vibrant Commons. We have with us today sociologist Amita Baviskar and environmental lawyer Arpitha Kodiveri, who will discuss environmental politics in the cities of Delhi and Bangalore and the question of the ecological capacity to sustain lives worth living. How well have these cities addressed the challenge of sustainability with social justice, and how can we create livable cities and vibrant commons? Are the questions that are being addressed today. The full bios of both the speakers will appear in the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and your questions can be posted in the Q&A box, which the speakers will address in the last half hour of the session. And with that, I give you Amita Baviskar.
Thank you so much, Lekha. Thank you very much to the Bangalore International Center for inviting me to speak. And thank you, Arpitha Kodiveri, for agreeing to join this conversation with me. I have to begin first with a confession. And that is that I had originally intended, and I told the organizers this, that my talk would span environmental politics in Delhi and Bangalore. But what with the last week of teaching, and what with the fact that my knowledge of Bangalore nowhere approaches the extent to which I know Delhi, the Bangalore bit, unfortunately, is going to get rather shortchanged in my talk. But I'm hoping that Arpita will add on there as a resident, long-time resident of Bangalore. And I also want to acknowledge that whatever I do know of Bangalore is based on the work of some stellar scholars and activists. Um, Harini Nagendra's work, Sharad Lele on the urban periphery of Bangalore, the environmental lawyer, Leo Saldanha, and the historical work of Janaki Nair have been absolutely central to my being able to think about cities, not just about Bangalore, but about all cities from the point of view of the approach that I offer here, an approach that I like to hope will apply to Delhi as well as to Bangalore. Delhi and Bangalore share many things. We have major environmental concerns around wetlands. In the case of Delhi, the river Yamuna. In the case of Bangalore, it's many tanks and lakes. We also have rapidly changing cities which have densified, become more congested, and the battle for what the city should be is actively fought in Delhi as well as in Bangalore. Let me also begin with a small caveat that the book that I'm discussing today, and I'm just going to share my screen with you, was finished last year and it came out in January this year. And since then, we've just been hit by a whole storm of events in Delhi. First, the inspiring anti-CAA and National Population Register protests in public spaces that reclaim the streets as a place for declaring allegiance to the Constitution. And then, of course, the pandemic, the lockdown, and the desperate plight of migrant workers who left the city and the national capital territory in order to go home, homes where there were no livelihoods, homes from where they were forced to come to cities in the first place in order to earn a living that was insecure and that disappeared when the lockdown began. We've also in this year seen in Delhi massive plans to remake the Central Vista, the iconic area around India Gate, from India Gate to the President's Estate, to the Rashtrapati Bhavan, around which there's been a great deal of mobilization. And we've also had Supreme Court orders peremptorily evicting tens of thousands of families who live in slums along railway tracks. So all of these events, in some ways, which have come after I've written the book, have made me go back and think and reflect about whether what I wrote in the book still holds. And I think that the overall approach or the analytical frame that I have offered in this book does seem to be useful in understanding the kinds of divisions and disputes that appear in the public domain, as well as those that don't. So, let me tell you how I got started on thinking about the urban environment um, a very, very long time ago, more than 20 years ago. And I want you to cast your mind, if you can, to a Delhi of January 1995, a cold winter's day, misty and in fact freezing, and the North Delhi neighborhood of Ashok Vihar, a well-to-do area with houses, what are called kothis, small-scale mansions. And in Ashok Vihar, on that cold and foggy morning, early risers were emerging from their warm houses for morning walks, bundled up in woolen jackets, scarves, and caps to keep out the chill. Some of them had pet dogs straining at the leash to go out. And as one of these gentlemen walked into the neighborhood's open area, an area they had designated as a park, he saw a young man, thin, poorly clad, walking away with an empty bottle in his hand. Our gentleman was outraged. He caught hold of the man and called out to his neighbors. Someone phoned the police. And within minutes, a group of angry house owners and two police constables descended on the youth and they beat him to death. Now, a report by the People's Union for Democratic Rights investigated this, and they found that the 18-year-old man was someone called Dilip. And Dilip had come to Delhi to watch the Republic Day parade in the capital. And he was staying with his uncle in a jhuggi or shack along the railway tracks on the edge of Ashok Vihar. His uncle worked as a laborer in the nearby industrial estate. And like all other planned industrial zones in Delhi, this estate as well had no provision of housing for workers. So, although the Jhuggi cluster had more than 10,000 households, mainly industrial workers living there, it had only three public toilets, each one with 8 latrines. So, we're talking about each latrine being shared between more than 2,000 people every single day. So, understandably, for most residents, then, any large open space under cover of dark became a place to defecate. And their use of the so called park for this purpose put them at odds with the affluent residents of Ashok Vihar, who then paid to have a wall constructed to separate them from the unsightly Juggi Basti and their own homes. But this wall was soon broken, not only by people looking for a place to defecate, but also to allow the daily traffic of domestic workers who lived in the Juggi Basti but walked across the railway tracks every day to cook and clean the homes and cars of the rich, to wash their clothes and mind their children. So Dilip's death was the culmination of a long-standing battle for a contested space that, to one set of residents, embodied their sense of gracious urban living, a place of trees and grass devoted to leisure, recreation, and doggy walks, and that to another set of residents was the only available space that they could use as a toilet. And if he had known this history of simmering conflict, Dilip would probably have been more alert and wary. Perhaps he would have run away when challenged, and perhaps he would still be alive. So, this incident made a profound impression on me because until that point, I had been doing research in central India, mainly in the Narmada Valley, looking at displacement because of dams and forestry projects, as well as the more gradual but not less compelling processes of impoverishment due to insecure land tenure. And I'd seen very often state violence that tried to crush the aspirations of people, poor people striving to craft basic subsistence with dignity. And now I was watching a similar contestation over place unfold in my own backyard. I'd looked previously at conflicts over the environment in rural India, and now my attention was directed towards how, in an urban context, too, the struggles over the environment were negotiated through rather different projects and practices. And this concern about what was happening in the city grew stronger as I saw two sets of processes unfold, each one an extraordinarily powerful attempt to remake the urban landscape of Delhi at the turn of the century. There were a series of court orders through which the Supreme Court initiated the closure of all polluting and non conforming industries in the city. And this order threw out an estimated 2 million people employed in and around 100,000 approximately working units. At the same time, the Delhi High Court ordered the removal and relocation of all Jhuggi squatter settlements on public lands, an order that demolished ultimately the homes of more than 3 million people. At that time, Delhi had a population of around 12 million. So the enormity of these changes was quite mind boggling, but they were hardly covered by the media. And both these processes were set in motion by the filing of PILs, public interest litigation, by environmentalists and consumer rights groups, which showed that bourgeois environmentalism, as I call it, had emerged as a concentrated force in Delhi. And the idea of the environment, which reflected upper class concerns around aesthetics, leisure, and safety, as well as health, had come to strongly shape the disposition of urban spaces. And as I tried to make sense of the changes in the city in which I'd lived since my birth, I found that there was a Delhi I knew nothing about. Even though Ashok Vihar was close to my home in North Delhi, I'd never gone into its Jhuggi bastis or the industrial area adjoining it. Geographical proximity did not translate into social familiarity. In my mental map of Delhi, these places were just invisible. And it was only when I set aside my taking for granted sense of the city, my privilege as a well off resident, and I started exploring bastis and factories and other urban places beyond the bourgeois gaze that I realized just how segregated my city was. When I looked into the history of urban planning, I discovered that while this spatial configuration was a product of deliberate design guided by benevolent intent, its inherent biases led to perverse outcomes. In Jhuggi bastis, with their open drains and gut churningly filthy latrines, I came to realize that spatial segregation also created an apartheid of the imagination. Even though the majority of Delhi citizens lived in such settlements, well off sections of the urban population simply didn't see or care about them. Despite the dense social fabric of daily economic transactions that brought them into contact with domestic workers, vendors, security guards, courier deliverymen, sales assistants, and restaurant staff, Delhi's upper classes remained socially incurious and spatially oblivious to where and how the working classes lived. Unless, of course, a Juggi Basti got up their nose and obtruded on their sense of urban order. Then they moved the courts, petitioning for the summary eviction of working class settlements, and their actions further intensified the persistent contradictions between a shared economy of work and a segregated ecology of shelter, the contradiction between capitalist accumulation and social reproduction. So, as I said, I began writing these essays on environmental politics in Delhi about 20 years ago. And I was fresh from the Narmada Valley. where claims about rights to nature and belonging in the nation were at the heart of a vibrant social movement, the Narmada Bachao Andolan. But in Delhi, I was struck by the sheer absence of any kind of movement from below. And although city dwellers shared environmental problems, it was really remarkable how the most vulnerable sections of the population were not only absent from the conversation, but they were vilified and victimized by the proposed solutions. At the same time, those who were best placed, who were the most privileged to address ecological issues, were actually blinded by their power, unable to acknowledge their own complicity in creating the ecological mess that we're in. And the concerted direction of bourgeois environmentalist initiatives has transformed not only transformed lives and landscapes in Delhi in the last 2 decades, but it has actually worsened our common predicament. And I just want to clarify that when I say bourgeois environmentalism, I'm not talking about those many environmentalists who make common cause with working class people in the city and who strive for their rights to the city, for their recognition as equal citizens. I'm talking about those who come to it from a place of privilege and whose approach is to try and create social order at the expense both of the urban environment as well as the city's working class populations. And as I looked at different aspects of the city and how it's changed, um, I thought it was also important to recount this history because we're often captive to the present. We forget how places and people used to be. We fail to see how the remembered past might inspire actions to recast the ecological and social relations in the future. So, when our imagination is imprisoned by the minutiae of everyday life, we need more than ever to stand back and reflect on what was and what might be. As cities have overtaken the countryside as habitat for most of humanity, the question of their ecological capacity to sustain lives worth living has become all the more critical. Yet, when we listen closely to debates about city planning and urban governance and carefully observe urban environmental campaigns, we notice that many of them often have little to do with either ecology or with justice. The very terms of the discourse, what is an environmental issue? Who is authorized to speak? Which modes of action count as legitimate? These terms are partial, particularistic, and perverse. And in this book, what I do is look at why this is so. And I argue that one, the power to define and deal with an issue as an environmental problem is unequally distributed. Social location and cultural capital shape who has the power to act, what are the interpretive frameworks that we bring to bear on defining an environmental problem and dealing with it. I also point out that the kind of bourgeois environmentalist initiatives we see are based on often selective and superficial framings of environmental issues. Um, the other thing that I try and point out in the book is that there's something about the urban environment which baffles us, which poses a peculiar perceptual problem because it's a little hard to understand the urban environment in terms of the commonly understood features of nature. When we think of nature, we think of trees, we think of birds, we think of rivers and tanks. But we have to remember that the built environment is also a form of nature transformed. And scholars, geographers, sociologists who talk about urban metabolism look at the ways in which both natural landscapes, resources, living beings, as well as the built environment together create a form of nature in which um, we cannot apply the template of natural resources that has been developed for understanding rural conflicts. So there's a problem of perception that we need to shift. And finally, in this book, I argue that urban environments have primarily been managed in terms of securing spatial and social order. This logic still continues to dictate environmental politics. And this has led to the setting aside of questions of ecology and justice in the city. And what I do in the book is to trace these arguments by looking at different aspects of the city, homes and workplaces, ordinary streets, and extraordinary spectacles like the Commonwealth Games. I look at so called natural features, but which have been hugely transformed in the city, like the Delhi Ridge and like the river Yamuna. And the context for not just what's happened in Delhi, but in Bangalore, in all other cities, is that of economic liberalization. The emergence of a real estate market in cities, the emergence of an affluent class to whom the benefits from liberalization have predominantly flowed, the imagination of cities as needing to be world class, smart cities, um, and the way in which the commercialization of cities, city spaces, the commodification of the environment has been driven by the desire to create more spaces for bourgeois consumption. This is the larger context, the backdrop against which I write. And as many of you know, Delhi was supposed to be a planned city, and state monopoly over the regulation of space was meant to promote the public interest. New Delhi was planned by the British, and following New Delhi in the 1950s, the Delhi Development Authority was formed in order to make sure that the city grew in an orderly fashion. And an enlightened state was meant to guide economic growth, molding it to the ideals of the modern city. But what happened, in fact, was these ambitions about social and spatial order were thwarted by the internal contradictions that transformed state capacity, all the sorts of vested interests that politicians, um, bureaucrats, and others brought to urban planning. And they were also, these plans were also undermined by the sheer complexity of the social world that they sought to control. So slums and squatter settlements came up in Delhi not as a violation of the planning process, not as a violation of the master plan, but as its inevitable outcome. The plan simply wasn't enlightened enough, simply wasn't participatory enough to actually accommodate the burgeoning need for places of work, places to stay that emerged from Delhi's population. But despite this paradox that slums came up not in violation of the plan, but because of the plan's inadequacies, the idea of the planned city still prevails, and it provides a kind of a fertile field for structuring both violence against people, demolitions that say you're in violation of the plan, but also structuring desire, ideas about what the city should be, especially ideas that are favored by bourgeois environmentalists. And these environmentalists often approach the courts to seek decisive action, to impose the kind of order that's essential to their sense of well being and security. And government officials use the plan as a weapon because it empowers them to extract rents and displace people. Everybody who is not in line with the plan is vulnerable. And instead of being a force for the good, in fact, the plan has reproduced the vulnerability of migrant workers whose labor keeps the city going. At the turn of this century, bourgeois environmentalist discourse about air and water pollution invoked the notion of public interest, and they persuaded the courts to shut down factories and firms. So we got a series of sweeping judicial orders that ended Delhi's life as an industrial city just when liberalization had opened up the prospect of land to be converted to real estate. And the big companies, they stood to gain from redeveloping land that their closed down factories stood on, but smaller firms were forced to mobilize to save their businesses. Ultimately, neither the court's directives nor the subsequent process of political bargaining and accommodation served to secure environmental goals. What they did achieve was a surge in distress for the city's industrial workers and who happened to lose their livelihoods but were not even allowed to represent themselves before the court. Um, and what we got were a series of orders which, although they claimed to seek what was good for Delhi, did so in a manner that silenced and impoverished a substantial section of the city's underclass. And the pictures that have been showing you of the Yamuna floodplain actually show one of the sites of big displacements that happened, not because of industries closing down, but because it was argued that the river was polluted by working class settlements. Settlements were removed, but but the river was then made available for real estate development. So the social space of the riverfront um, was was cleared up on the grounds that people who used the river and who lived along its banks were polluting it. These were mainly working class settlements. However, the problem was actually coming from well-to-do areas. Most of the sewage in Delhi is not treated before it's released into the Yamuna. Industrial waste also goes into the river. So we see a misunderstanding, a misrecognition of cause and effect, but with consistently adverse effects on working class populations, resulting in the kind of demolitions that the book looks at in great detail. Most of the people whose homes were displaced um, did not receive any form of compensation. Only about a quarter of them got small plots of land about 40 kilometers away from where they live, far away from the places of work. And many therefore lost not only their homes, but also their jobs as a result of being displaced from the banks of the Yamuna. And these are all the documents that you had to assemble in order to show that you were in Delhi before the cutoff date. And the process of identifying a cutoff date means that most of the residents of slums couldn't claim anything and were forced to shift outside Delhi to the border of Haryana and UP in order to begin life afresh. And as I said earlier, most of these processes received very little, I mean, minuscule attention in the media at that time. Um, Along with the idea of cleaning up the riverfront, closing down industrial units where manufacturing took place, what we have seen in Delhi is also a huge assault on the idea of what the street should be. And I'm putting together these small vignettes about city streets together with the campaign to clean up Delhi's air, because in many ways the processes are the same. Rushing to the courts to try and get them to take action, um, courts giving orders which end up penalizing those who are the least responsible for creating the problem in the first place, while those who went to court, the bourgeois environmentalists, their own practices um, and their contribution to the problem gets ignored. And I think of streets as an embodied form of the public sphere. And streets include not only walkers and vendors, cars, bicycles, buses, but also cows and dogs, other living things with whom we share our with whom we share our city. And I describe in the book how the aspiration in Delhi to be a world class city has meant that cows and things like cycle rickshaws are seen as anachronistic elements. And bourgeois environmentalist claims have tried to remove them from the city, saying that this is not the kind of city we want. It shouldn't have place for cows and dogs. It shouldn't have space for cycle rickshaws, because cycle rickshaws are a form, even though they're non-polluting, even though they give employment to huge numbers of people, they're an embarrassment in a world-class city. And as I go on to show, despite the attempts to try and so-called, clean up the city, the attempts to remove cows, to remove cycle rickshaws, and to remove street vendors actually come undone, because there is a strong interdependence between these particular living beings, these groups of people, between municipal officials, between the citizens who rely on these low cost services in order to survive. So, and as I said earlier, these bourgeois environmental campaigns um, are coming from elites who choose to ignore their own consumerist lifestyles, especially their toxic enchantment with personal motor vehicles, with cars and with motorbikes, and the way in which private automobiles are disproportionately responsible for environmental harm. So we see a set of conflicting and contradictory interests and actions that end up creating an unruly republic of the streets, where the problems persist, where inequality still persists, and we have still not devised a more democratic way of including everybody in that notion of how city streets should be, who should be there and who should be not, who should not be there. How we acknowledge and include the presence of non human beings in the city continues to be a huge problem. And when we think about nature in the city, most urban scholars focus on trees and green areas. But there's very interesting work happening now, especially with younger scholars, some of them affiliated with the National Institute for Advanced Studies in Bangalore, working with Professor Anindya Sinha, who point out the ways in which pigs, dogs, black kites, and other and cows happen to be as much a part of the city as human beings, as the built environment. And to that, I would of course add, in the case of Delhi, the presence of the Yamuna, a river that the city has turned its back towards. And I've looked at the way in which the Yamuna floodplain, which has historically been a neglected non-place populated by low-key working class settlements, it came into view as a place of value in the real estate economy, some of the slides I showed you earlier. And once the floodplain, which is a part of the city's commons, has now come to be enclosed and commodified, excluding those who depend on it the most. And I've tried to show how resistance to the seemingly relentless process of making the floodplain a place of capital accumulation has come about not so much from the people who were pushed out by the redevelopment of this area of the floodplain, but in fact by the river itself. The river's powerful seasonal pulse of floods ends up, in a way, reclaiming the river and the floodplain and keeping it free from encroachment by the commodifying processes of creating a world class city. I also look at Delhi's urban wilderness and the way in which new species have taken it over. Areas have been transformed from being relatively wild scrub forest into parks where middle class people come together in their identities as people who have a fitness regime, they take walks in the parks, they exercise, they have laughter clubs. And at the same time, these transformed from wilderness to parks, these transformed areas still accommodate all kinds of unexpected urban uses. In the case of green areas, these are often young people, courting couples looking for a place to to explore friendships, romantic relationships, and it is green areas and public places which provide them, ironically, with privacy. And it's it allows these green areas therefore allow young people to explore new forms of sociality, new identities as romantic people. So there are a lot of contrasting yet convergent voices on the urban environment that I try and bring out in my book, contrasting ways of using the environment, species and natural entities like the river, which have their own power to shape who we are and what we do in the city's different contexts, and of course across different social groups. So I look at how this bourgeois environmentalist discourse, which has been so powerful in shaping spaces in the city, can be replaced by other claims to nature. Claims not only by the power of nature, its own agency to shape cities and place limits on what we can do. And we've seen these limits at work in the floods in Chennai, for instance, or in Hyderabad, or in, for instance, earlier in Mumbai, where you got a clear message. You can't build on wetlands, you can't block rivers, you can't turn them into sewers. Um, but we also have to think about how environmentalist discourse can be challenged by working class citizens as well. And I think what we've learned in the last few years is the absence, is in fact the limit of relying on courts to do the work of environmental activism that is also respectful of the rights of all citizens. Um, Many court actions on urban issues have been punitive uh, against the working class. They've also been rather paternalistic, and they've rarely matched their intentions. They've ended up penalizing the wrong people, and they pushed, in the case of Delhi, often the problem somewhere else. If they're polluting industries, get them out of Delhi, put them somewhere else. Um, Stop something today, push the problem to the future. So the court orders have rarely created long term administrative capabilities or accountability. And important, they don't actually substitute for the very difficult work of understanding the dynamics of urban life and shaping them through a democratic dialogue about the city. So, if this process of appealing to the courts in order to shape the city is deeply flawed, so is the faith that administrators place on techno managerial fixes of the smart city kind. And this is what's now talked about a lot. The Smart City mission was launched 5 years ago in 2015, but the term still remains ambiguous. What is a smart city? Most analysts point out that this seems to focus primarily on improving efficiency rather than equity. It relies on employing corporate consultants to offer solutions based on information technology. And the smart city model is heavily weighted towards securitization and the surveillance of populations. And it's designed to sideline the question of democratic accountability. And so, what happens is that such solutions, so called, to urban problems, in fact, demand much closer, more critical scrutiny that has happened so far. Yet they offer opportunities for making money at public expense, for installing new kinds of IT equipment. So there's a lot of hype around the smart city project, but their ability to improve urban environments and environmental rights for everyone remains unknown. So, if on the one hand, one model of improving cities for the future is about smart cities, the other model is that of um, leftist scholars who propose a radical rethinking of how our cities should be organized and run. And they say that if you look at most cities in the global south, they don't ever conform to plans. When the governments of newly independent nation states imported models of urban design from affluent industrialized countries, they actually failed to accommodate local political, economic, and cultural forms. And this mismatch between southern cities' cultures and the idea of the planned city has led to the flourishing of what have been called unintended cities, where people left out of plans have made their own arrangements, putting together homes and workplaces from the modest materials available to them. And these informal dwellings are more affordable and they can better accommodate people's own specific needs and styles of working and living. These Jhuggi Bastis embody the ingenuity and enterprise of working class populations. And they take control over land and housing from the state and put it in the hands of the poor. Their only handicap is that they happen to be illegal. So it's argued if you give these informal settlements formal recognition, then such bastis could become the basis for democratic city making from below. Now, this is a beguiling argument, and it appeals on populist as well as pragmatic grounds. It suggests that informality is not only the signature of cities in the global south, but also their strength. So rather than unsuccessfully trying to stamp it out, government should support such efforts at self provisioning and trust that people have the innate ability to devise solutions that work best for them. So, this celebration of jugaad, of innovative fixes that make the most of scarce resources, I think it makes a virtue out of wretched necessity. Legalizing such settlements would indeed remove the stigma of criminality and the burden of uncertainty that working class people have to labor under. And there's no doubt that such crippling conditions of existence must be done away with. But the trouble with such reprieve is that it risks consigning the city's population, working class population, to a second class life. There's a double standard at work when those who are privileged to live in formal, well appointed neighborhoods advocate the perpetuation of substandard dwellings in the name of poor people's rights. Finally, when it comes to the urban environment, such advocacy of informality also ignores a really important issue, and that is that the ecological question demands that we think not only of human populations as heterogeneous, as shaped by hierarchies of power, but that we keep in mind our obligations to future generations and to other living beings. An ecological vision that respects these principles and applies them to the complexities of urban life is unlikely to emerge from any one social group. It needs vigorous social debate and sustained collaboration between different citizens, between experts, administrators, to move cities towards environmental sustainability. The solid waste problem, for instance, just can't be solved by waste pickers, sorters, and recyclers alone. It needs concerted action at the level of national, municipal, and neighborhood organizations so that we can cut down the quantities of waste generation. And the thing is that if you cut down the quantities of waste generated, this goal may go against the short term interest of waste pickers. What this problem needs also are technically informed inputs about materials and safe methods of recycling. It requires experienced and energetic managers to operate systems that work at different scales. It needs enabling enforceable rules and regulations. All aspects of urban life throw up these complex challenges, but the environment all the more so because the environment means championing social justice in the present, yet doing so without sacrificing the causes of those without voice. The claim to speak for future generations and non human species has so far been the prerogative of bourgeois environmentalists who have stood by and shrugged at the denial of rights and displacement of poorer people that their actions have caused. So, taking away from them the privilege of speaking for the future and for nature can only be done by new alliances that spark new ways of thinking. And this means that a whole set of social relations should be challenged. We need to respect the cultural logic of informality and recognize rights to housing. But by themselves, these steps don't enable wider claims upon the city as a whole. They don't allow the working classes to contest how the urban commons, land, water, air, green areas, are shared and used, managed, and transformed. Environmental justice requires a more expansive, a more inclusive process of decision making. Um, just the grant of housing rights is not going to guarantee that. So, what we need is a conversation about the commons based on the core criteria of citizenship as well as civility. And this idea of civility is something that I believe means that we must go beyond directing our attention to the state, to the courts all the time, because rights only guarantee so much. There's the work of respecting everyone in the city, of being able to work out relations that can create greater equality across divides of caste and class, of gender and religion. And that civility towards others can only come about through a wider mobilization, one that, of course, acknowledges the role of the state, but does not expect the state to be the ultimate addressee of all our efforts. I've already spoken too long, so I'm going to stop here and end by saying that the idea of citizenship as well as civility um, is something which has in very many ways been embodied in the very promise of cities. This is what cities were supposed to do. They were meant to allow new ways of being, places where strangers could come together, live together, work together, places of opportunity to recast and reshape oneself, create new identities. So that potential of cities, that promise of cities, is both a source of inspiration as well as a call for action. Thanks very much. And I look forward to Arpita's comments, questions, thoughts.
Thank you so much, Amita. I think that was such a sort of a really nice overview of the argument that you make, and it ended on a beautiful note of hope. So, the question that I wanted to kind of begin with was this tension that you kind of address in your book of where bourgeois environmentalists sort of bypass, the hard work of mobilization and directly approach the courts. And civility you offer as an alternative to try and help build some of those networks and alliances. So in Bangalore too, we've seen instances where, for example, the encroachment that happens on lake beds, and when there's a drive to sort of evict those encroachers, it's usually the poor that get targeted first. So I'm wondering, sort of in this kind of alliance building, where do you see the role of courts kind of transforming, or do you see that as sort of as just one big sort of one cog in that big matrix of levers?
Well, this actually speaks to your own research, Arpita, doesn't it? As an environmental lawyer and as someone who studied and looked at judicial processes from close up. Um, well, I think the courts and as you know, there's a lot of discussion around the way in which the public interest litigation modality of action by the courts uh, appeared to be the most effective way of galvanizing action around intractable issues because executive capacity had come to be seen as just so inert, so corrupt, and the PIL form allowed for a leapfrogging over the kind of inertia that executive institutions had achieved in order to, you know, make sure that people who lived on the street were not evicted. This was the famous Olga Tellis judgment in the Bombay High Court. So in the beginning, there was an attempt in the in the higher judiciary to try and recognize the constitutional rights accorded to working class citizens, to the very poor, and so on. But I think that the kind of the context really changed from the late 1980s, the early 1990s onwards, which is the context of economic liberalization. And that was a context which not only resulted in big changes in political economy, but I think also in the ways in which elite Indians imagine themselves. And there's been a growing social distance from other working class citizens. And I think this is something that's reflected in the mindset of the judiciary as well. So when I look at the kinds of judicial decisions which have, which have anything to do with the environment, I see first of all that there's a very clear um, sense that economic interests, which means business as usual, corporate interests, should be protected. Then there's a bit of concern about the environment. And there is, at the very bottom, almost negligible, is this focus on working class livelihoods and so on. So there's absolutely no attempt to try and think about ecological justice, which is why we get these sweeping orders, which are hailed by bourgeois environmentalists as, this is what we need to fix the city's problems, which end up just, sort of pulling the ground from under the feet of working class settlements. So I think that there are good reasons why people go to the courts, but those reasons are themselves the result of a failure to mobilize on the ground. And to be honest, though, bourgeois environmentalists have never been interested in even engaging with people on the ground, right? Because it's below their dignity, and it's always been about pulling strings and making use of connections. That's how things get done.
Absolutely. I mean, it takes me back to the wildlife first case that's before the Supreme Court at the moment, which is challenging the constitutionality of the Forest Rights Act. The other question that came to mind as I was reading was this, and you mention it, I think, throughout the book, is sort of the aesthetics of the city and this aspirational idea of the world-class city. And a lot of it kind of changes the relationship one has with nature in the city. And I think Harini Nagendra also speaks to how in Bangalore, the lake sort of transformed from being a space of culture and livelihood to recreation. So I was wondering if you could speak a bit about that aesthetics and the sort of relationship that citizens share with the environment in the city.
I think that aesthetics, everybody has a sense of aesthetic. I mean, even the um, most modest juggi will have before it a couple of small recycled pots where they might have a tulsi plant or a rose bush or something. Um, Urban aesthetics, both from the point of view of what the state has tried to impose and what privileged people have wanted to secure, has been very strongly influenced by what's been called a modernist vision, which is that of order, an order where not only are spaces clearly segregated in terms of function. So you have residential neighborhoods which are separate from the business district, separated from the places of leisure that you just talked about, and that this is a spatial order which is also a social order. So a place like a lakefront shouldn't be a place where you have people washing dishes or clothes. It shouldn't be a place where there's a set of juggis, tumbling close to the water. because this is um, untidy, this is dirty. And it's not just about the middle class gaze, it's about the senses, it's about the smells of people, it's about the larger ambience that informs people's sense of what is a good place or not. And of course, increasingly, this ambience is also about the air. So, going into an air conditioned shopping mall, now that's world class, right? Because it's cool and it's contained and it's also a gated place. So, I think we need to transform our aesthetics, and that's not going to happen anytime soon because we're looking at probably 150 or 200 years of ideas about what beauty is. The beauty is order. So how does one get people to see the beauty of dense settlements, the beauty of color, and the vibrant life that unfolds, that happens in these. Sometimes what we see is a little bit of a sort of touristification of urban cultures which are dense and vibrant, where you say, oh, like let's go on a heritage tour of Shahjahanabad, and isn't it beautiful, and isn't it all quaint and culturally important. um, what you need to do is recognize that there are other places which might not have that historic depth, which might not be 500 years old, but which are nonetheless equally vibrant, equally culturally important as places where people live and work. And then these are also places where people want help with making them more livable. The places smell because there's no good garbage disposal, or because there are no toilets, so children have to defecate outside. You fix those problems, and any basti where people live will become a decent place where people are proud that people are proud to call their own. So I think that we need to re-educate our eyes, and we need to, move away. We need to be also aware of the ecological costs of what we are producing. The densification that's happening in Bangalore or in Delhi, where you get tall skyscrapers, um, the stress that they place on water resources, on parking space, the congestion that they cause. Um, the ways in which they end up hogging resources, making life uncomfortable because they're air conditioned, all the exhaust heat makes temperatures rise for everybody else. There's a way in which we need to think about what our ideas of beauty and comfort are, and how they can be made more democratic. And this, of course, includes the green areas and their distribution. In the center of Delhi, in the Lutyens bungalow zone, you have wonderful green areas. But the minute you get into a basti, you'd be lucky to find that one peepal tree or the one neem tree under which somebody can sit in the shade.
Absolutely. I mean, it's funny you mentioned this because I usually go to Sankey Tank, which is a local tank close to my place, for a run, and they've sort of been constructing a jogging track. Um, and you have the communities who are basically working on that construction now, using the tank for different purposes. And you often have, the elite sort of walker sort of scoff when they look at these communities, kind of using the lake for different purposes. And so that kind of leads me to my next question, which I'm hoping might kind of bring a lot of the themes that you've been discussing. When we start to frame citizenship in the city on the basis of a commons and something that brings together the different citizens to negotiate and collaborate, do you feel like that has the potential to break some of the state business nexus that we've started to see that define and shape the city? So, for example, in Bangalore, with the whole encroachment of the lake bed, the government hasn't really successfully gone after the big builders. So they've kind of still been left off that regulatory oversight. So I was wondering, where do you see the potential of the commons offering sort of an avenue to break that nexus, if at all?
I think the idea of the commons is very hard to um, promote in cities that are so unequal. The very idea of the commons is both there as a kind of attractive but distant ideal, and yet something that elites shy away from. So a number of people will say, I love walking in the streets of London or Paris or Singapore because, you see all kinds of people on the street. Now, that's not the sort of experience that they want their cities to be like. People are very clear about gated communities, security guards, gates and barriers. When they go out, there's a sense that, I want to be in my little bubble, which is my car. I don't actually want to deal with the unruly republic of the streets. So there is a kind of contradiction there, but I think it's a contradiction that you know can be worked with. I see, for instance, as areas in Delhi such as the Central Vista, which as we briefly mentioned, is now going to be redeveloped in order to be much more built up with government offices, so that a lot of the open areas where people go each evening, just to have a good time, to buy balloons for their kids, to eat an ice cream. That's what the India Gate lawns are well known for. Um, to enjoy being in a large open space with these grand buildings. That idea of a public space is something which a lot of people across the class spectrum, I'm not talking about the elite here, but everyone who can afford to bicycle there or come on the metro can actually enjoy the India Gate lawns. And I think in that uh, form of usage, there is the notion that you can create some sort of a common platform. I mean, what's happening to our open areas, to our commons in the city, um, are often what are called, and I think of the air as also a commons. These are binding crises. They actually affect all of us, because if the river is turned into real estate, the floodplain of the river, if the air is as dirty as it is, then nobody can escape from this completely. So, how do we create that sense of shared interest among groups that are so widely divided? And I think that here there's little that I expect bourgeois environmentalists to do, because their very tendency is to, um, distance themselves from understanding the real problem, who's responsible for it, and then, looking into themselves to see how they're complicit in the problem. But I do see a lot of environmentalists who are working with working class settlements. In Delhi, there's a Yamuna Ji Abhiyan that has mobilized farmers who've been cultivating the floodplain seasonally, in order to say, let it remain a commons, and don't build on it. But we still have the Akshardham temple, the Commonwealth Games village, but all of these were actually fought against. So I think fighting and making a case and getting people to realize what you know working class people and their settlements bring to the city is tremendously important. The National Alliance of Street Vendors in India has done that. They've created a political space where people recognize that street vendors are actually fantastic in providing us with a range of services. There are people who now have videos about particular kinds of street food. There's laws being passed to try and protect the rights of street vendors to public places. So one has to fight for different aspects of the commons. So I think it's an ongoing battle, and I think it's happening in Bangalore, it's happening in Delhi as well as other cities, but we just have to kind of strengthen it.
Excellent. So we have quite a few questions from the audience. So I'm going to start with some of those. So you have Hamad Ahmed, who asks, do minority social communities have unequal access to the environment? What explains such disparity in ghettoized areas and colonies? with socially heterogeneous populations?
Hamad, I wonder, is this the same Hamad whom I know from Stanford? Anyway, um, that's if it is, then hi Hamad, wonderful to run into you after I think about 15 odd years. Um, this question of minorities is, of course, also a question about class, because as we know in India from the Sachar Committee report and from number of other, sorts of studies, there is a strong connection between, for instance, being Muslim and being poor. And therefore, there is, a huge differential in terms of access to the environment. And wherever there has been political violence directed against minorities, in the case of Delhi in 1984, against the Sikhs, and this year, as late as this year, against Muslims, what we find is that these riots have been uh, followed by shifts in residence and work, so that more and more people from different religions tend to concentrate and live closer together just to feel safer. So there's a kind of cycle of ghettoization that takes place, and because of the existing disadvantages in terms of lack of political power, these ghettos end up being places that are also underprivileged in terms of services, in terms of parks, and so on. But I think what we saw at the beginning of this year was an absolutely extraordinary takeover of public places by communities that had been invisibilized and ghettoized. Not just Shaheen Bagh, but what was going on at Jantar Mantar, what was happening on the steps of Jama Masjid, Selampur, a whole set of areas outside Jamia Millia Islamia University. What we found was just the making visible of people who have been disadvantaged in this city. What happened subsequently because of the lockdown, because of the riots, is of course another story. But I don't think we will forget those moments, and I don't think we will forget the way in which they attracted not only people from specific communities, but also a huge number of students, now young professionals, people who felt that there was something at stake there that was about um, claiming the nation and recognizing the rights of everyone to belong to it equally.
Excellent. So we now have a question from Simran, who asks that you've kind of spoken about how bourgeois environmentalists sort of use the courts. So a question is about how does the executive then navigate that tension between the goals of the bourgeois environmentalists and the rights of the marginalized?
Yeah, well, that's actually very interesting because the real business of accommodation, negotiation, Simran, actually happens with the executive, and there is often very little consistency between what the people at the top are saying and what's actually happening on the ground. So, in each case, there is a great deal of negotiation. Um, Most of it is to do with accommodating people who can, in some way or the other, pay their way into getting the bureaucracy to look the other way, or it's about not offending politically important constituencies. So, if you look, for instance, at the Supreme Court order that said that you can't have commercial establishments in residential areas, there was this immediate uproar from traders across Delhi. And sure enough, the Urban Development Ministry passed rewrote the law in order to say, well, now it's okay, you can go ahead and have commercial establishments in residential areas, because they didn't want to antagonize this very powerful and I should also say prosperous business community of traders and shopkeepers in the city. Um, However, we find that that doesn't necessarily apply to slums, because the land that the slums are sitting on have since economic liberalization come to be identified as a source of profit. So that commodification potential means that the bureaucracy is reluctant to try and accommodate people. Though I should point out that in when you have a populist party like Delhi does right now, the Aam Aadmi Party, you do find that they have generally tended to not evict people from the areas that they control. However, a lot of land in Delhi, in fact, the biggest two big landowners in Delhi are both not under the control of the Delhi government, but under the control of the central government. That's the Delhi Development Authority and the railways. So most quarter settlements happen to be on land that belongs to these agencies or some others, and the Delhi government really can't do anything very much by way of stopping the evictions if they're ordered by the courts, as they so frequently are.
Excellent. So Lakshmi asks whether there's a possibility for bourgeois environmentalists to interrogate their privilege and whether they'd be sort of open to looking at alternative standards of living and sustainable consumption. That way, it might ensure a decent quality of life for everyone.
Um, so far, I think bourgeois environmentalists, and I think by their very location and their very sense of what the city should be, uh, I think it's going to be extremely hard for them to um, change the comforts and conveniences that they take for granted. I think it's going to be very hard to persuade them that uh, water quality or air quality are things that you need to address through common collective action where everybody's interests are taken into account. You can't just buy your filters and air purifiers and make sure that you have the best private medical care and basically parachute your way out of what are common predicaments. So how do you go about changing things? Some of the court orders that we've got have also been, equally short-sighted. Things like installing smoke towers to clean the air, where you would think, well, first you try and control where the pollution is coming from, right? And there again, the big blind spot has been private automobiles. How does one change that? I think that change is can only come about when something unprecedented happens. We know the example, for instance, of wartime when people are willing to accept rationing. Um, Similarly, I think that, and this is, a sort of problematic. This is not the best kind of solution. That when we face environmental crises from which elite can't escape, then there are possibilities of there being ways of trying to figure things out by limiting consumption, by creating greater equity. So, when you get, say, um, a flood that affects everybody, then it's possible that everyone living in that particular area will have a common interest in, say, allowing a wetland to be restored, allowing lines of drainage to be restored. We know that in the case in the city of Surat, when the plague happened, it affected everybody, and therefore there was a concerted effort after that to deal with the solid waste problem. So there are, I think, uh, crises, often unfortunately catastrophic ones, which take a huge toll on society. but that end up being catalysts for bringing about change. And uh, sometimes these come together with the efforts of people who've been trying against all odds to change things from the bottom up. And I think when that kind of convergence happens, then things do change in terms of both what people are willing to live with, what they are willing to share with others, um, in order to bring the discussion of what cities should be in along more sustainable lines.
Madhura asks if in your work you've noticed caste dynamics in the way the spaces are used, and if so, how is that negotiated?
Um, well, caste dynamics in the city, of course, continue in everyday life, in the sense that if you look at who's dealing with sewage, who's dealing with, um, with household waste or keeping the city streets clean, all of those jobs are, of course, very much still um, relegated to Dalits. And of course, in Delhi, and I think in a lot of other cities now, those at the very, very bottom, and those are Bengali speaking Muslims. So there is a kind of um, underclass, undercaste that prevails in the city. And we know that caste dynamics still exist around household spaces. If you look at domestic workers, who is allowed into the kitchen, who is not, who's allowed to open the fridge, who is not, who is served their tea in which particular teacup. All of these are ways in which caste is, caste has been, caste has permeated the negotiation of spaces, even at the intimate level of one's own home. Um, but perhaps your question is really about public spaces. And I think their cities have been somewhat kinder. And in some ways, that promise of the city towards greater equality that I alluded to earlier is something that is reflected in the songs of um, bhakti poets, especially those of Dalit caste, the idea of the city and not the village as the place of equality. Um, you know, Marathi bhakti poets have talked about Sundara Nagari, the idea of the city as beautiful, as Begampura, the place without pain or sorrow. So, this notion of the city as a place where you can shed your stigmatized identity is a powerful one. I think it happens fitfully, though. It's something that is still in the process of struggle. Whether housing colonies allow only people of a certain caste, whether there are still, ways by which uh, urban jobs too are shaped by, what your name happens to be, whether you're upper caste or not. There are a lot of professions and a lot of jobs where caste still prevails, even though these are supposed to be quote unquote modern jobs, as the economist Ashwini Deshpande has shown. So there is nothing that is truly caste neutral in the city. But I think that the potential for being caste neutral is there far more than in the countryside. And that too is the promise of the city.
So we have one last question. It's from Aditya. Firstly, he says, thank you for your brilliant book. He then says that in Bangalore, apartment enclaves are becoming more complex. He says that many are returning from abroad and they're trying to remake the neighborhoods through engagement with civic corporations and the local government, particularly on questions of the environment. So he's wondering how these engagements, kind of reflect the idea of bourgeois environmentalism, or what do they do to it?
That's a really interesting question because I I know I have friends who do this, who have moved to Bangalore, who have installed, rainwater harvesting systems in their backyard, who are composting all their waste, and you've gated community. I think there are laws which actually support your doing that, which a city like Delhi is just medieval in this respect, that even the simple things we could do in terms of reducing the amount of waste that goes onto our landfills, we haven't taken those steps at the community level. So I think that Aditya, the people you're talking about um, do bring refreshing ideas, and many of them, for instance, especially men in the, say, 30s 40s group, also happen to be enthusiastic bicyclists, and they've added a new voice to this whole issue of the street, and safety for bicyclists, and just getting away from the overwhelming presence of motorized vehicles. um, I think those are great initiatives, but while there is a certain environmentally conscious bourgeois person that is being sort of cultivated here, people who are buying sustainable, who are supporting sustainable businesses in terms of the products they consume, especially food and so on, they need to move beyond their personal lifestyles. And while they might be lightening their ecological footprint to a certain extent, we are still far too embedded in the unequal dynamics of the city to really make that much of a difference, unless there's a movement outside these kinds of personal politics to a wider city wide sorry to a city wide engagement with housing conditions for the majority, um, with making sure that there's water and sanitation for in the bastis where domestic workers come from, where courier people come from, where taxi drivers come from. Unless there's a sense of the city as this common project, and that is a common project where civility doesn't mean saying, thank you, bhaiya, nicely to the auto rickshaw driver. But civility really means respecting the labor and therefore the right of the worker to be in the city. So I think that these kinds of new ideas that returning immigrants, white collar professionals bring are tremendously important, but they also need to push themselves to think about these really knotty and complex problems that dealing with issues of class injustice entail.
Excellent. So thank you so much, Amita. I think this was amazing at different levels in terms of both relooking at Bangalore's environmental politics and where we're at, as well as getting a glimpse into Delhi's ongoing issues. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Arpita, for everything and for steering the discussion in this terrific way. Thanks.
We have just been afforded a sobering look at the way our cities are organized, or should I say misorganized, and how some of us encroach by the sheer virtue of entitlement on not only on resources and more importantly, the sense of dignity. I, for one, have ordered your book already and await reading it. Thank you, Amita,
Thank
for
you.
the framework to understand what really our cities are, with the urban inequity that exists, the elements of urban ecology, commons, and justice, these words that we really have to hold on to, and that ideally should reside within it, and what us as occupants have contributed to creating these creatures. Uh, Thank you, Arpita, for being such a great interlocutor. And thank you, everyone in the audience, for joining us this evening. Good night,
Yeah.
everyone, and see you next time.